You're watching or listening to Private Members Club, and in this emergency edition of the podcast, we have reconvened to talk about Liz Truss because it doesn't seem barely a week can go by when we don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
I'm Ian.
I'm John.
And I'm Simon.
And I'm going to try and play our theme music in now. This is probably not going to go to plan, but here we go. Going to give it a go.
Have you seen Tumbleweeds? I've seen Tumbleweeds.
Well, it's kind of thematic, isn't it? Really?
Yeah, podcasting gold.
John, just because you couldn't hear it doesn't mean it didn't come up on my recording at my end of the podcast. So you now talked all over the funny bit at the end, which Ian had a preview of. And
I've heard it. I listened
have
to it
you?
as well. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I may have to mute you out for that bit.
Nothing new there then.
If it even worked. So, oh my God, where do we start? Okay, I'm going to start with a prediction. Because when I made a prediction that Liz Truss was going to be the next Prime Minister after Boris Johnson, I got laughed off the podcast. So now I'm going to make an equally bizarre prediction and see if I get laughed off the podcast again and see if it comes true again. I'm going to predict that Jeremy Hunt's going to be Prime Minister by next Friday.
Interesting.
Okay, so nobody's arguing with me yet. Does anybody, before we talk about what happened, I mean, I don't know if there's a lot to say about what happened this week because it just happened and everybody's seen it. But I mean, what did anybody think? Ian, you're our correspondent who is from the United Kingdom, but who doesn't currently reside in the United Kingdom. So what was it like watching all this happening from over the pond?
It was absolutely glorious to watch. I do take inordinate pleasure in watching the unfolding soap opera from Downing Street. I didn't think this series could possibly top the Boris Johnson couple of series, but oh my lord, she was. I mean, irrespective of the politics leading up to her statement, just the performance and the awkwardness with which she kind of swept the room looking for friendly faces, couldn't remember anyone's name, kept saying it was just so embarrassing. And
finally she went to Robert Pest.
Yeah. And on. Yeah.
And if anybody missed what she said the first time around, that was okay, because she took 4 questions and just repeated the entire statement that she'd originally made by way of an answer to all 4 questions. So we had it 5 times over, and it still only lasted 9 minutes.
And the answer was still wrong, because she kept saying she had brought stability to the market. I mean, she hasn't. She's gearing up to trying to implement a series of ministers and policies that will ultimately bring stability to the economy, but that's not happened yet from what I can see over here.
Not anymore, because today's turn of events is that basically Jeremy Hunt has rode roughshod over everything that she said. She's been booted to one side, and in all but name, he already is Prime Minister, and she's effectively without any power at all now, because he's literally turned over almost everything she had in her manifesto and as part of her statement.
So where does this leave the more Sunak dream team?
I don't think they stand much of a chance. Let's get on to what might happen next in a minute. Let's find out what John and Simon made of yesterday. We're recording on Saturday, so all of this happened yesterday. Simon, were you able, I suppose you and both of you probably were at work. I just happened to be home, so I was able to watch the whole thing unfolding live. And oh my God, that was one of the most bizarre days. Simon, were you aware of what was going on while it was happening?
Yeah, I got an update on my phone. Very naughty. I've got my phone at my desk, and it came up on there. But the best thing about it was hearing the effects kind of echo through where I work. And then hearing back from various people, and then I was on the phone to IT support at one point, and then all of a sudden the guy was talking to me, then suddenly broke off and went, "Oh my God, the Chancellor's gone," and then carried on the conversation again. So it was all history playing out as I was having a normal day at work. So yeah,
see, that's one of the funny things about it, is that generally this kind of stuff Generally, this kind of stuff is at a slightly lower level than it is now. But generally, people aren't that bothered by what goes on in Parliament, except as to when it actually impacts upon their day-to-day life. But because I suppose since the Brexit referendum, politics has started to have a much bigger and a much more direct and a much quicker impact on our everyday lives than it really did before. People are taking a lot more interest now. So like you're alluding to, Simon, people who probably wouldn't be that interested in who was the Chancellor are now ultra interested in the fact that the Chancellor's just been sacked, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, this morning, my wife and I went for a dog walk to a place fairly near us.
Is that a euphemism?
We finally get onto a serious subject. Anyway, where they sell posh coffee. That's not a euphemism either. No, but you get, it's a place where they've got various Tesla charging points. That's not a euphemism either. And you know, you get a certain clientele. But I was overhearing conversations between people who I would ordinarily imagine would support someone like Liz Truss, who sounded very scathing and were talking about, somebody overheard was talking about how there are so many billionaires or millionaires, no, billionaires in this country, and that you could take one of their incomes in order to cover a load of the stuff that would sort out a lot of this problem.
Oh, totally.
And yeah.
You know, in this country, the highest rate of income tax 40 years ago was like 80%, and now it's down to 45%. That's almost half the tax that the richest people in this country pay. They're no longer paying, and that's just going straight into their investment accounts. It's not going into the economy. It's not being used for public services. It's not being used to raise the minimum wage or to pay benefits or anything. It's almost like the last century in politics didn't happen. And okay, this is late stage capitalism at work, and this is not going to last forever. And in a couple of generations' time, they're going to look back at this and just say, what the hell was going on there? But just at the moment, this is kind of same kind of tragic that we had back in like 1930, 33. It's not so very far removed.
Why do they not try trickle down taxation?
Did it trickle up something?
Well, it's worth remembering with these tax cuts, when it was cut from 70 to 45p, that was funded by North Sea oil, and that money is no longer as prolific as it once was.
Yep. We don't have the tax system to pay for the things that the tax system needs to pay for anymore, and it really needs tightening up. And 12 years of Tory rule is not where you're going to get tightening these things up. But John, haven't asked you yet where you were, what you saw, what you made of yesterday.
I was actually with my wife, because she used to work at the BBC, getting her alumni tour of the Cardiff studios. So I was able to watch it on screens all around. It was great.
Wow.
And talk to the channel, you know, the people who watch the BBC Wales channels and you know, get the feeds in from London, who are just changing their minds on the news all the time. So it was fascinating to watch. It's so calm on, you know, with rapidly changing events, you know, watching Kwarteng drive off in his car. It was absolutely fascinating. People just watching, and this has been exactly the same sort of thing as Simon. People who you would think would just vote Tory until the apocalypse, which, you know, might only be next year, but we'll see. Were absolutely, you know, having a go at Truss. She was getting slaughtered by them. And the big problem is, because I don't think I've done one of these for a while, is that as a government, they have completely lost trust. They totally misjudged the space they had to work in. Just, you know, come in, make huge changes, and without any kind of mandate from the public. And all of a sudden, the public going, "We don't want this," and the market's going, "You're being daft. We have to." I think Paul Krugman called what happened on the bond markets a moron premium on the British debt.
The trouble is, you've got Truss and Kwarteng and the rest of the ERG and all that group of people, they want to take us back to a time in history where politics was different and where people cared less. And the trouble is, these days, even people to the right of politics are more interested in a more caring type of politics than we had before. If you look at Cameron and his government, for example, now I'm not a fan of Cameron or his government, but compared to the government we've got now, Cameron and his government look like a bloody Labour government by comparison, right?
I wouldn't quite go that far.
No, but do you know what I mean? What I'm saying is they've lurched even more to the right with Johnson and his libertarianism, and now Truss and her trickle-down libertarianism. And that's not the way the country's going. And so, I mean, I think we can see what's causing this, and we can probably also see where it's going to end, because in a couple of generations' time, like I say, all the people who are causing all this now will be gone, and the people who replace them will be with people who sort of grew up, in this country at least, in more of this sort of more caring environment. Because whatever way you look at it, schools, colleges, the places of education now are geared more towards looking after people and looking after the individuals. And while that doesn't necessarily always work, and clearly under 12 years of Tory governments, it's not working anything like as well as it should do, at least that's in the atmosphere, and those people are going to improve upon that situation in the future. So this isn't going to last, but just for the moment, it is a fascinating and horrifying thing to have to live through, and the sooner it's over and done with, the better. And so here's my thought is, so I kind of got a question and an answer, so I'm going to place the question out in front of you and see what you think of my potential answer. And the question revolves around the fact that we've had 4 Tory governments. So it's not just one government that's lasted 12 years, it's 4 Tory governments. And what you have in each of those governments is a cabinet, and you have people who are allied to the cabinet. And when that government gets replaced by the next government, that cabinet finds itself out on its ear, and the next cabinet comes in, and new people become allied to that cabinet. And by the time you get to the 4th government, you know, your 350, 400 members of parliament, however many you've got, are so divided between 4 different prime ministers, 4 different cabinets, 4 different varieties of the political ethos that you're supposed to share but don't actually, that actually the Tory party now is kind of quartered and infighting. And what I think has happened this week, I think the Kwarteng situation possibly has been forced on Truss by the sort of the silent, nameless Tory grandees that you never really hear about, who've probably taken her to one side, said, get rid of Kwarteng, do something about this, because this situation is untenable and your premiership is untenable. And so she's had her hand forced by those sort of shadowy forces at the back of the Tory party. But I think that one of 2 things has then happened, because Jeremy Hunt is, to all intents and purposes, more towards the Sunak end of the economic spectrum. I think either the Tory grandees, whatever you want to call them, these sort of shadowy people that I was talking about, I think either they have imposed Jeremy Hunt on her as a kind of backdoor coup in a sort of gradual attempt to get rid of her and instate him in her stead instead. Or else she heard whispers that they were going to instate Jeremy Hunt and has placed him as a cabinet. She heard whispers that they were going to replace her with Jeremy Hunt, so she's put him in the Chancellor's office instead to try and head them off at the pass. And it's backfired because he's effectively, in the last 24 hours, taken over her office as well as his own, from what I can gather. And I'm just wondering if this whole thing was supposed to be this coup to get rid of Liz Truss by next week. And she's actually walked through the trap door and set the trap for herself, frankly.
Well, there's something, because I was reading Twitter earlier tonight, and I think the Sunday Times reckons there's 100 letters of no confidence gone in already.
Yeah.
If that's true, she is pretty much toast, because, you know, she might be technically safe by the rules, but it didn't save Theresa May, did it? Theresa May. So.
They've already said they're going to change the rules to get rid of her. Pretty much. I don't think they've said it out loud, but they've certainly intimated that in such a way that the press have picked up on it and are now repeating it. So if Truss wants to get saved by the rules, that's not going to happen.
No, and again, the important thing to remember again is she was, there was less than a third of the Tory party voted for her. And I believe when she had the meetings with the MPs earlier this week, at least one MP had a go at her for the fact that she and Kwarteng had rubbished the previous 12 years of Tory government along with Labour. And, they called it all brown-eyed economics. And I wouldn't exactly call, Osborne, Hammond brown-eyed at all.
Plus, of course, if you're going to sort of rubbish the sort of 12 years that have gone before you, you've got to remember that a good deal of those people are still in that government with you. And they're the ones who are handing in the letters. Yeah.
Can you name someone who's been a minister in that government for 10 of those 12 years?
I can only think of one.
There you go.
And she's about to not be a minister of any kind anymore, by the look of it.
I mean, it's extraordinary because obviously the rules are that you can't have a leadership challenge in your first 12 months, but we've clearly reached a point where that rule's going to be swept aside. And Graham Brady will tap her on the shoulder and say, have a drink, Liz, we need a chat, you're out. This is like the end of John Major's government. The feeling right now, and I'm only guessing what the feeling's like because I'm 3,000 miles away, but the kind of shambolic daily collapse and necrotic collapse of government feels like the end of John Major.
I'd say it was more the Major years were kind of more prosperous. I think the better comparison might be Callaghan, with that sense of perpetual crisis.
Well, in terms of because Britain votes Tory unless Britain really hates the Tories, and in my lifetime that only happened in '97. But I feel like we're at that point again, where even people who read the Express and the Sun have finally had enough. That's my hope. That's what I'm feeling.
Yeah, we'll have to wait and see on that.
Yeah, I mean, because the other thing is, if they did call a general, I don't know that the Tories wouldn't get in again, frankly.
And plus, of course, they've got another 2 years before they need to call a general election, and we know what the Tories are like. I wouldn't put it past Boris Johnson to make a return in the next 2 years and go into the next election. And there's enough people who still support Boris Johnson around the country that could still win it for the Conservatives, insofar as, getting enough seats to form some kind of a government. And we know that the way politics in this country works is you've basically got one party on the right and several parties on the left. And unless the several parties on the left, one of them can get a big enough number of seats, or they can come to some kind of coalition, the party on the right is going to form a government despite having, much less of the vote than the left-leaning parties.
True, but I think you've got to look at the fact that they have just completely lost trust because, this government came in and just flipped everything around. Labour can simply attack them with, would you trust them not to do that again, mid-term?
Oh, sure, but, Labour have had that many times in the past, as Ian alluded to, and people still tend to vote to the right in enough numbers that the Tories can form a government, unless it gets to such a point that it goes sort of beyond any kind of a pale. Well,
yeah, but as I said, the polling for the Tories has never been seen before. This 19-20% some are giving them. Their floor has always been like 25-29%. So,
but that's it. If Truss is gone, if Truss is gone by the end of next week, then those figures have only got one way to go, sadly, because they're not going to get any lower. They can only get higher. So let's talk.
You say that there's a long winter ahead, and possibly high fuel bills, possibly high mortgages. That's going to kick in the government. It was Osborne said about Brown. Doesn't matter if it's your fault or not. The public is still going to blame the government.
That's fair. So let's talk about Hunt for a minute, because I don't know if I'm really that serious about Hunt, but I think I am serious. And actually, I tell you what, I was already thinking about Hunt before they announced him. So when Hunt was announced, I was like the least surprised person in the country. Or no, I say when Hunt was announced, he was about 5 minutes before he was announced. suddenly the rumour escaped that he was about to be announced, and I was the least surprised person. And then on The Rest is Politics, what's his face? Oh, name's
Rory
gone right out.
Alistair Campbell.
Alistair Campbell
All
is
right,
talking
I
about
had
the
a
fact.
50-50 chance.
Yeah. No, Alistair Campbell was predicting Hunt would be the next Prime Minister on yesterday's The Rest is Politics too, which I listened to this morning. And so he's basically backing up all the things that I was already thinking. Because, okay, I'm going to lay my case for Hunt, and then we'll see what the other candidates are, what anybody else thinks might happen next week or over the coming weeks. Hunt, this is not about who I like or who I would like to see, because clearly I do not like Jeremy Hunt and I would not like to see him as Prime Minister. But if you want to work out what your enemy's going to do, you've got to try and think how your enemy thinks, right? And the way I think the enemy thinks, the Tory party thinks, is I kind of think they're going to double down on the thinking that put Truss in. When you had those 9 candidates up after Boris Johnson, it was a mixture of sort of left field candidates who sort of came out of nowhere and you couldn't really sort of imagine 6 or 12 months ago being in contention for a prime ministership, suddenly getting lots of votes because all of a sudden they were maybe the exciting thing. But as the vote went on, so initially you got people like Sunak getting a large part of the vote and Morden getting a large part of the vote. And as the process goes on, Truss, the sort of timid nobody candidate who didn't look like they were going to rock the boat, suddenly comes to the fore. And when she turns up, all of a sudden they realised that by not rocking the boat, what she was going to do was try and set the country back 50 years, which was going to rock the markets instead. So by choosing a candidate who wasn't going to do something radical in terms of progressive politics, instead they put somebody in who would do something radical in terms of retrogressive politics, and that's what's caused her downfall. I think the reason why Hunt has sort of now come to the fore is because he is like the older, wiser, calmer version of Truss in terms of personality. So the thing about Hunt that most people who know him seem to say is he's not empathetic, but what he is calm and sensible. And I think what the Tory party will want to do now is put somebody in who can sort things out in inverted commas, in a calm and sensible way, so that you don't get the panic that's greeted sort of Truss's first mini budget. And I think that's the thinking, whether right or wrong, and whether that actually is what he or they would do or not. I think that's probably going to be at the forefront of their minds. And so I think that's why Hunt was put in the Chancellor's office yesterday. I think that's why he's basically taken up the reins of power already. And I think that's why he's my prediction to be Prime Minister this time next week, frankly. So now I'm going to throw it over to you three. Do any of you have predictions or thoughts about who else it could be, about what else might happen? Does any of you think Boris Johnson might make a comeback, or is there somebody else that you can see who could come in instead? John?
It's tough because the Tory party is so horribly factional right now. Even down to the fact that they've kicked out essentially almost anyone sensible, which is anyone who could be described as centrist even.
Just on that point, before you go on, that's another reason why I think Hunt's there, because he's been in government or in positions of power throughout all of the sort of last 4 prime ministers. So he's kind of the one candidate who's not associated or disassociated from any of those sort of factions. So Hunt seems to be just about the one person in the Tory party at the moment who's not tainted by faction, if you know what I mean.
Could be. I mean, and if Hunt does take over, I think you'd probably see Sunak back as Chancellor because, rightly or wrongly, he's seen as a kind of a steady pair of hands, and the predictions he made during that leadership challenge, the leadership elections, have basically come to pass. So his reputation has gone through the roof. But, you look at the candidates, what was it? Was it Braverman stood, Badenoch stood? Then if they win, we're in trouble because they couldn't unify the party. They're too extreme for half the party, and that's worrying enough as it is. I don't think they vote for Javid. who made enough of an impact. There were only 3 candidates, so you probably see Penny Mordaunt come on in a significant role, even though I don't think she's particularly competent.
Depends if there's a vote as well, of course. They might just impose somebody into the position, which, you know, at this point wouldn't be beyond the realms of possibility.
No, Ian there just looks as if he thought of the picture of her in a swimsuit that goes around the internet.
Is there? Let me Google that. I'm just fascinated that you're criticising Penny Mordaunt's competence under a Liz Truss premiership. I mean, Penny
It's all
Mordaunt
relative.
can't walk in a straight line, I'm sure.
That's where it comes from.
Simon, have you any thoughts?
First thoughts with Jeremy Hunt as Prime Minister. He's a good old-fashioned vampiric Tory, isn't he? That's the impression you get. Blood-sucking, emotionless machine that spouts the party line in a very calm and clinical manner, and it's very hard to get past that.
And given the last 2 prime ministers they've had, you know, Truss and Johnson, I'm talking about, that's exactly what the Tories are going to think they need right now, right? I think
guess so.
He's the perfect person in their minds, I'm sure, to go up against Keir Starmer, who is, you know, he's forensic, he's calm, he's unflappable. They need someone with gravitas and statesman-like, you know,
Who could at least project,
kind of aura,
yeah.
who can at least go toe-to-toe with him. I mean, you know, the thing with Hunt is that anyone who's ever worked in either the NHS or education in this country would sooner vote for Hitler than Jeremy Hunt. So, but he's the best, you know, he's the unity candidate. How have we got to this point?
I know. Well, the funny thing is, though, anybody who's ever voted, who's ever worked in education or health, shouldn't be voting Tory anyway, should they?
Good point, well made.
No, because all the savings they've made on public sector over the past 12 years or so has basically been keeping wages down, keeping investment down. So, yeah.
Exactly so.
And can I say, I'm really impressed by how often we have said Hunt on this podcast and not slipped up.
Yeah, fair point.
How do we think the next 2 years are going to play out? Because, you know, my fear, it may be a naive fear, but I just wouldn't, particularly if Johnson got back into power, would be that somehow they would change the rules, that they wouldn't have to have a general election in 2 years' time, that they would, you know, put that kind of stuff through, you know, Trump level of changing, you know, putting changes into democracy, because I can see it happening. But I mean, it's either that, you know, you see, you know, everyone's saying general election now. Well, the Tories aren't going to give us a general election unless they literally run out of politicians. You know that story about Gordon Brown, when he left Number 10, he left a note saying there's no money left in the.
But that's a tradition.
And they'll leave a note saying we've got no one left in the party.
So I see your fear, and it is a valid fear, but I don't think Boris Johnson is the sort of man who's going to do that. I think he's too old school. He's too much of a traditionalist. I think Braverman would do that. I think Priti Patel would have done that. I think there's a lot of figures on the right of that ERG wing of the cabinet and the government who would change the rules in that way. But I don't think Johnson would do that. I never thought I'd have a positive feeling about Johnson, but there you go.
I mean, when you've got PR being spouted by the Labour Party now, I mean, that's going to put the fear of God up the Tories, surely.
The trouble is with Johnson is that he could do that Trump thing and say, well, I was ousted unfairly. It wasn't the people of the country who ousted me. And that's his way back in, isn't it? And you can see that happening. I don't think there's much of a suggestion yet that could happen. I think there was one thing he said in the last couple of days that people have kind of taken as a hint that could possibly be the case. But he's not really done or said anything yet to indicate that that's his thinking. But it wouldn't take an awful lot, would it? Because that was his dream job and he wants it back, I'm sure.
He might do. But in these circumstances, when the Tories are absolutely cratered at the bottom, he wants to take on someone as lightweight as Jeremy Corbyn in terms of electability. He doesn't want to go up against a Labour Party that's 30 points ahead in the polls. His ego won't stand for that.
But they know it might be his ego that says that's what he wants to do.
I mean, he may want to do a Churchill and come back and be Prime Minister twice, you know.
So what the Tories will know is that Boris Johnson is an election winner. Unfortunately, he's proved not to be that great at anything else. So what they will do is install him a month before they're going to go to the country. So we've probably got 18 months before he comes back, and then they'll just bring him in. If their position needs shoring up before the next election, assuming it's in 2 years' time, which who knows?
Yeah, so we get another week of Liz Truss, 18 months of Jeremy Hunt, and then a couple of months of Boris Johnson and an election in May of 24.
Yep.
Interesting thoughts. Right, we've done half an hour. Unless anybody's got anything they desperately want to add, I think that's probably enough from us in these people's ears for the evening. Anybody got anything that I've missed or that they feel we should cover before we do go?
Miriam Margolyes?
That's already covered.
Now, I saw that described on the news as a foul-mouthed rant, and I disagree. I don't think a one sentence is
very well thought out.
It wasn't a rant at all.
I think
also, I was a little disappointed that she was talking about Jeremy Hunt, and it was the F word that she was in trouble for, and not something else, right?
Absolutely.
Going back to
talk about open goal.
Exactly, it didn't happen. But people listening to this on the podcast and maybe watching this on the video will have heard her saying those words at the end of the opening theme music. Until we come back and do all this again, which I'm assuming is probably going to be at some point within the next 7 days. I was JR.
I was Ian.
I was John.
And I was Simon.
And we will speak again soon.